And welcome back to Whiskey Politics. I'm Dave Sussman, your purveyor, whiskeypolitics.net. You can find us at ricochet.com, America's Voice Television Network, all of your favorite podcast applications of choice, and also on YouTube. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button on YouTube. Not a lot of news going on this week, as there doesn't seem to be any week anymore. It's crazy. Just in the past 24 hours, I've had to rewrite some questions here for our guest today. And speaking of our guest today, we're delighted to have back, it's been, I think, a couple of years, one of the finest writers on the conservative side of the aisle, National Review's roving correspondent, contributor, Kevin D. Williamson. What do they call you now?
I think it's still Roving Correspondent.
Roving Correspondent. How are you?
I'm well. You only know that if you read to the end of the articles, of course.
Thanks for joining us again. I got to, first of all, before we get into some of the issues of the day, I got to slay the elephant in the room. The Atlantic. A lot of our listeners are going to, they've read some things have been said. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you were brought on board, and within a couple of weeks, there was the outrage mob that was immediately created by its readers to have you fired because of a snarky comment you made on a podcast a couple of years earlier. And you're talking about a lynch mob here. They wanted you fired, and within 2 weeks, Jeffrey Goldberg did fire you. Is that about the right of it?
Well, I think you got the timeline wrong. I think I was fired on my third official day at work.
Oh, really? Okay. A lot quicker.
Yeah, pretty quick. So, but maybe 2 weeks after the announcement that I was going to be working there.
Gotcha. So, they go after your livelihood here because of something that you said that they don't like. It's this totalitarianism that we're seeing right now. What is going on right now with this almost, and I want to say lynch mob because in my opinion, that's exactly what that is.
Yeah, well, it's complicated. It varies from institution to institution. In my particular case, as much as there was the excitement on Twitter and the rest of the social media, I don't really think that had much to do with why I was ultimately let go by the Atlantic. I think it was more of an internal thing there. People on staff who were uncomfortable working with someone with my political views. So it's a very odd moment in our politics because these senses of tribal identity have really superseded policy and discourse and discussion. And there's this sense of if you are on the other side, you are automatically the equivalent of Hitler. If you disagree with me about transgender issues, you are a Nazi. If you disagree with me about affirmative action, you're a Nazi. If you disagree with me about abortion, et cetera, et cetera. It's broken into a sense of moral absolutes governing every disagreement.
Where did this come from? I mean, we're talking about a genesis here that goes back decades of political correctness. And but it seems just in the past, maybe even just in the past year, it's mushroomed into something that's really, really ugly.
Well, yeah, in some ways. I think that, social media didn't create this dynamic, but it did reveal it, and it does amplify it. I actually think these things are really pathologies of affluence and boredom. There's so little at stake for most people because we live in such an affluent, peaceable, prosperous society that they look for things to be outraged about because being outraged gives you a sense of meaning, a sense of authenticity. It's a way of showing that you care about the world, that you are intellectually and morally engaged. And it's a status marker in a sense. And but it's something that is an obsession of a very, very small part of our society. When my little thing happened at the Atlantic, it was a big deal in the world of media and people who are interested in media careers and who write for magazines and websites and that sort of thing. Outside of that tiny little world of 1/3 of 1%, whatever, of the population, nobody cared. This is not something that is of general public interest. I don't think it's a very, very inside baseball thing for people who are media obsessives of one kind or another.
Well, it may be an insignificant number as part of the population, but it doesn't, I think, take away from the gravity of this. I mean, and I want to get into this in a little bit more detail with you further in this interview regarding the attack right now we're seeing on free speech. Has anybody from the Atlantic or the leftist media, did they stand up for you?
Well, Connor with the Atlantic wrote a column in the Atlantic arguing that they were wrong to have done what they did. But no, not generally. And Connor, of course, is a conservative.
Right.
It's a purely tribal thing. So it's it's an us and them kind of thing, and you're not going to really see people crossing lines on this. And of course, a lot of the people who wrote about it and talked about it really didn't know what was going on or have much of an idea. Paul Krugman wrote this really funny column about it, which starts off, Kevin Williamson at the Atlantic, and then it was like 11 paragraphs about Larry Kudlow, and then something else about me at the end. And it was clear that he'd written a column about Larry Kudlow, and someone said, "Hey, can you work in this instead?" It's it's one of those things where one of the big differences between the current era of journalism, which is online, and the early era of print, I was a newspaper editor for most of my career before I came to National Review, is that there is this, sort of ravening maw of stuff that has to be filled up. It's not a 22-inch page anymore that has limitations on it. And so people feel the need to write about, whatever is happening in this 5-minute period. It's no longer even a 24-hour news cycle. It's a 12-minute news cycle. And so there's a lot of, empty and useless commentary about these sort of things. And a lot of it is just, turning the crank to keep the rubes riled up, which is what a lot of advocacy journalism, unfortunately, is about these days.
Have you heard from Jeffrey Goldberg?
Well, I corresponded with him a little bit when I was writing about this immediately after the fact because, unlike Paul Krugman and the people who write for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and a number of other publications, I tend to talk to people when I'm writing about them, and check out quotes and that sort of thing. So we had a very civil exchange about what I was writing. Just wanted to be sure that I was clear and correct, and that I was representing his views as accurately as possible. And look, I think Jeff Goldberg is a good guy and he's a fine editor, and I'm not, personally upset with him or the institution about this. I like the Atlantic tremendously. That's why I decided to go to work there. I think he made the wrong decision in this case, but people make wrong decisions from time to time.
I read somewhere that the reason was that your statements or whatever it was that was in the podcast, I think it was about abortion, was too provocative. Yet the Atlantic had people that are so far more provocative. I mean, Hitchens, right? So what was the justification to you?
Well, it was unpersuasive. Let's just say that. It's an inside institutional thing of and certain interior, I think, institutional factors there that I don't think I should probably go into in public. Gotcha.
All right. I respect that. We met a couple of years ago, and it was during the presidential campaign. And we did a 2016. And I think it was in Las Vegas. And we had a small interview, and then we sat down for lunch afterwards. And you mentioned something that stuck with me. You mentioned that you don't vote.
No,
right?
I don't.
You live in Texas. I think you're also in New York. Is that correct?
No, I lived in New York for about 8 years, and that's where National Review's main offices are. But I got to where I was traveling for work so much that it kind of just didn't matter where I lived. So I lived in Vegas, actually, for a year. And I'm currently in Texas, where I'm originally from.
Right. So you're in the red state of Texas, which a lot of people are saying can be one day purple, maybe even more blue. But for someone that writes extensively about politics, I still find that somewhat surprising. How do you classify yourself politically today?
There's a big difference, I think, between my philosophical views, if you want to call them that, and my operational political preferences. So, philosophically, I'm a pretty extreme libertarian, borderline kind of, well, maybe not anarchist, but, sort of a Nozikian, far fringe libertarian guy. In terms of actual operational political preferences, I'm basically an Eisenhower Republican. I believe in caution and iterative change, consensus, compromise, all that sort of stuff. So if you ask me, what do I think about X, Y, or Z as an absolute moral principle or as an intellectual exercise, I'd maybe give you one answer. If you said, what do I think we should do politically this year about X, Y, or Z, I'd probably give you a different answer.
So to nail you down, you call yourself an Eisenhower conservative. That's interesting. You know,
I jokingly call myself an Eisenhower anarchist.
Anarchist. That's right. That's right. Yet at the same time, we got a wonderful highway infrastructure bill that was passed.
Oh, that was terrible. That's the worst thing Eisenhower did in office was the national highways. I could talk for an hour about that. You don't want me to, but that's exactly what people who complain about central planning and these giant government programs and the way that they get twisted by political incentives. The national highway system is the #1 example of that.
Right, right. So,
other than that, I like Eisenhower a lot.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, I like Ike. You're looking at a profound point in American history as well. I mean, talk about Cold War and everything that was going on during those days. And I want to get into this in a little bit more detail here. I'm going to take a quick break here in just a moment. But I'm fascinated by your perspective on politics because I read you a lot, and I genuinely don't always agree with you, but I respect you because I think that you're writing with intellectual honesty, and you've pretty much stuck to your guns. You haven't changed your perspective as long as I've been reading you. And I want to talk about post-presidency here, or post-election, I should say, during this presidency, and what has changed and what hasn't. As we return here at Whiskey Politics, Dave Sussman here with Kevin Williamson. We'll be right back. And we're back here, Dave Sussman, Whiskey Politics, and we have Kevin Williamson. Kevin, so when we spoke a couple of years ago, again, it was during the campaign, and you were absolutely 100% for multiple reasons against candidate Donald Trump. As much as I've read you since the election, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you really haven't changed your mind that much about this president. Is that correct?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Let's get into this in a little bit more from a standpoint of policies right now. Can you name any policies that you are happy with?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think a lot of what's been happening with the regulatory reform, particularly over at EPA, is very good and useful. Like every other conservative, I'm happy with his judicial picks, not just at the Supreme Court level, but also throughout the rest of the federal courts. Trump, his administration has been in some ways better than I expected, in some ways worse than I expected. In the ways that it's been better than I expected, the people around him have, in spite of his rhetoric and his tendency to say crazy things on Twitter and all the rest of it, caused his administration to operate as a more or less conventional conservative Republican administration. Donald Trump, for most of his domestic policy anyway, with the exception of the trade stuff, is not operating in a way that's radically different on policy goals than if Paul Ryan were president of the United States, or if Scott Walker had won, or if Ted Cruz had won, or something like that. International relations, of course, is different. The trade stuff is bad. His habit of alienating allies and undermining important multinational institutions like NATO is worrisome, and I think that it's something that is probably more problematic than is generally appreciated right now because, we're not really at war. There aren't any shocking foreign developments for us at the moment. So we're very focused on pretty small ball domestic stuff right now. But in the long term, those things are really very important. And I think that he's probably been a maybe even slightly worse than I expected influence. In some ways, I kind of thought that, Donald Trump, for all of his showmanship and his reality television background and all that, is a grown adult and who's been around for a long time and seen some things and done some things. And I sort of expected that when he was actually sworn in and sat down in the office and got his first briefing and understood the magnitude and the gravity of his position, that it would change him, that he would, grow up and, cease to be the social media, late night Twitter warrior that he's been for so long, and would take a more mature attitude toward his public statements, particularly as involve international issues, which of course the president is so central to, and that hasn't happened, and that is worrisome and disappointing.
A lot of different issues there, and I'd like to unpack a couple of them at least. What was your opinion of Ronald Reagan in the 80s trying to negotiate with NATO?
Well, for a second grader, I think I had pretty...
Come on, you weren't writing in second grade?
No, well, did I write anything in second grade? Maybe the first thing I wrote that I really remember being interested in was maybe around sixth grade. So came a little bit later.
I don't think you're that much younger than me. You must have been around much of your Reagan was what, through high school for you?
No, I graduated from high school in 1991. So
oh wow, okay.
The verge of the Clinton versus Bush campaign.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Reagan was reelected when I was in sixth grade. I remember because
Gotcha.
I was leading the sixth grade team on the pro-Reagan side versus my friend Mike Dietz, who was on the Mondale side.
Yeah, you were coming in as I was leaving. So,
yeah.
Okay, but obviously in retrospect now, you take a look at it, because if you go back and you look at the tapes, much of what, and I had Grover Norquist on a couple of days ago, we were chatting about this, much of what was, screamed about and the media went crazy about, and a lot of the left in Europe were crazy about as well, was how dare they, this president talk to NATO and try to restructure and do all this stuff. Very similar to what we're seeing today.
Yeah, I think that one of the differences, though, is that Reagan was looking at these institutions from a point of view of reforming them because he thought they were important. I think Trump doesn't look at it that way. He looks at them as a drain on American resources, as a way in which other countries somehow exploit us and get over on us and that sort of thing. So I think that there's some important differences there. One of the things that is similar is, of course, that Reagan, as far as the left was concerned, especially the international left, was treated as the devil incarnate. I was certainly old enough to remember that at the time. What was that show with the puppets? And they were always really upset about Reagan and Genesis Video.
Yeah. It was a British show.
It was on American television for a while, I remember. That was,
it was brilliant, by the way.
Comparing Reagan to Hitler, that kind of stuff was pretty common stuff. The Ramones song "Bonzo Goes to Bitburg," all that business. The media and the left, of course, get hysterical every time there's a Republican president. It's just what they do. I was joking with someone, it might have been Howard Dean a while back, that every time there's a Republican president, it becomes, well, the last Republican president, we look back with it, nostalgia. This one's the worst one there's ever been. He's the most radical one there's ever been.
Yeah.
When it was George W. Bush, they were thinking about the great statesmanship and genteel humor of Ronald Reagan. Now that it's Trump, it's, man, don't you miss George W. Bush? 10 years down the road, people will be saying the same thing. Well, this guy is so much worse than Donald Trump was, and yada, yada, yada. I think what Howard Dean says was, even though we say that, that doesn't mean we're wrong. Okay, good point, maybe. But that's just it's an aspect of news reporting as entertainment. People don't really go to television news, especially for information. They go to it for mood affiliation and affirmation of their views and biases and emotional state. And so you're always going to get from a Democrat-aligned media the point of view that whoever the Republican is when there's a Republican in the presidency is the worst one ever and the most dangerous character since Genghis Khan or Adolf Hitler or whoever.
And in the moment, if you were to say Code Pink in 2003, that one day you're going to look back at George W. Bush and reminisce and think kindly of him, do you think that you could say that today to those that hate this president, Trump?
Oh, I think that you will, whether it's sincere or not, if there's another, conservative Republican president 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road, you'll hear the same thing you're hearing right now, that he's a unique and special danger, that the Republicans and conservatives who came before him weren't so radical. I work at National Review, and people consistently, I hear this all the time now, talk about, we remember when conservatives were like William F. Buckley, and they were so intellectual and erudite and that sort of thing. People hated him when he was alive.
Right.
Left hated him, detested him when he was around. And the same thing will be happening. That same kind of emotional dynamic will be at play, which is why, and maybe I've made this clear without meaning to, that the sort of day-to-day politics and the day-to-day, media outrage mongering and all that sort of stuff is something that I find just tremendously boring. And that's one of the reasons why I don't write about that sort of thing too much. Every writer and columnist in America is going to have a Michael Cohen column in the morning. I'm not going to. Those sorts of things I just don't really find all that interesting. People's reactions to them are sort of predictable. I mean, the most interesting thing I've done in the last couple of months is visit an Amazon fulfillment center.
And that's what makes your writing so interesting. And I want to get into some of those articles here. And we're just going to take another quick break, and we'll be right back here with Kevin Williamson. And we're back here, Dave Sussman, Whiskey Politics. And again, if you are watching this on YouTube, please make sure you hit the subscribe button. You can also rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and find us on America's Voice Television Network. Here with the roving correspondent or contributor, or I keep losing my thought on, because I saw you, when I saw you a couple of years ago, and we were sitting down and talking. It was about the National Review. Then you obviously had the situation that occurred with the Atlantic early this year. You just came right back into it. They just said, come on in at National Review, continue where you left off. Is that correct?
Oh, I think I took about 3 months off, and I did a lot of freelancing in New York for some other publications. And I still write occasionally for other outlets. I write for the New York Post, and sometimes for Commentary and Weekly Standard and a few others. And every now and then for the Wall Street Journal, and I think I had a piece in the Washington Post a while back, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and you wrote a very interesting piece recently. I want to get into in a little bit more detail, and I think it kind of brings together a lot of the issues that we've already brought up here. And you refer to socialism as the new libertarianism. Can you expand on that?
Well, it's a word that people fixate on and cling to without really thinking too much about what it means. So a lot of people who describe themselves as libertarians are essentially people who are culturally on the right, but understandably embarrassed to call themselves Republicans or to want to affiliate with the Republican Party, which, let's face it, is a fairly embarrassing organization much of the time and something that a lot of people don't want to be affiliated with. I quit the Republican Party many years ago over Arlen Specter, which in retrospect seems kind of quaint. Things.
When he switched parties, or when he?
No. When W and a few of the others, Santorum, really went out of the way to carry him across the finish line against Pat Toomey, who was challenging him, and who was a much better.
Oh, you didn't want him. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So there was that. Where was I going with this? So a lot of people, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are mirror images of one another in the sense that they both have party bases that are very angry and very, very disappointed with their party leaderships. So the whole Tea Party movement on the right was not about opposition to the Democratic Party. I think that was largely misunderstood. It was about opposition to the Republican leadership. That's really where it came out of. They wanted a distinctive kind of right-wing political movement. And the Trump movement was very much the same thing. It was a rebellion against the so-called establishment. And on the Democratic side, you have the same thing. The Bernie Sanders movement was about that. And people who call themselves lately socialists on the Democratic side, I think, are really just putting a flag out to say that I am more radical than my party establishment, that I want a more left-wing, more progressive, more confrontational Democratic Party. Because if you look at the sort of policies these folks are excited about, most of them aren't what you would call socialism, at least under a classical definition of that word. They're more kind of Northern European welfare state politics. They don't have in mind socialism per se so much as they do the Danish or Swedish welfare states, which have issues of their own, but they aren't exactly what you would call socialism either.
Okay. So it's a comparison from the standpoint of, I guess, vanity?
Well, it's a tribal thing. It's an identification thing. And look, a lot of the people on the right who call themselves libertarians are very much, with Trump on things like restricting trade, which whatever you think about that as a policy, it's not a libertarian policy. They're very much with Trump in terms of strengthening the federal commitment to the so-called war on drugs and that sort of thing, which may be a good policy, may be a bad policy. I think it's a bad policy, but whatever it is, it's not a libertarian policy. People call themselves that just a way of distinguishing themselves from the, run-of-the-mill Republican partisan. And I think the word socialist on the left is performing much the same function.
Okay. Getting back into some of these issues, when I take a look at the trade policy, at first it concerns me as a right of center, libertarian leaning in many different issues. But then you read and you listen to people and you understand that maybe this is a long game approach and that maybe his ultimate goal for all of this is no tariffs and no barriers. Isn't that the most libertarian result that you can get from all of this?
Well, I think that if his goal were eliminating tariffs and trade barriers, he would be proposing policies to eliminate tariffs and trade barriers. I think that there is a tendency for people to extend to Trump on policy matters the benefit of the doubt that he hasn't really earned. If Trump has some, ingenious long game for a global free trade regime, he's been hiding it since the early 1980s, since he's been making public statements about trade. So I don't think that's actually a very plausible analysis.
You don't think it's a plausible analysis because of his approach to this negotiation?
The only issue he's really been consistent on throughout his career as a public person talking about policy issues is his opposition to free trade. So I'm willing to take him at his word for 30 years of more or less consistent statements on that.
So what do you believe? I mean, you had Juncker and the EU come out last week and say that they're looking to come to the table. You've got China now that's obviously suffering from their own individual bad economy, talking about this is a different kind of president. We can't just roll over him like the past 4 or 5 people we have done. Don't you think that, again, the ends justify the means? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But is this just not a negotiation tactic to get to what he is hoping as far as free trade? Mexico, for example, coming to the table.
Yeah, no, I just don't buy that. I mean, the Juncker thing was kind of a farce. It was an announcement of an agreement to negotiate, to have negotiations. Well, okay, super. And actually, if you look at it, the scope of it was limited to non-automotive industrial goods. So the things that we hear the most complaints from the White House about, which is the automotive market and one of our leading export sectors, which is agricultural goods, are both off the table.
Right.
So if that's a really slick negotiating strategy, it must be one that is so slick that we're not actually even pursuing what our main interests on the negotiating front might plausibly be said to be. So again, I think you have to, it's motivated reasoning, right? You have to want to come to the conclusion that this is part of a grand strategy, to buy that as evidence that this is part of a grand strategy. I think it's just more of a less, ad hoc, day-to-day, see what we can do, see what we can make of it kind of attitude, which is more or less characteristic of the president himself on most issues.
Okay. GOP, it's been the party of strong national defense, peace through strength, a la Reagan, less regulation, lower taxes. Where do you think Trump is failing that today?
Oh, well, again, as I said earlier, on the regulatory front, I think things were pretty good. And I had some reservations about the tax reform package, but I think that the change in the structure of corporate taxes was an important thing, if not the...
You didn't think he would push it through, if I remember correctly, or would be able to push it through.
What?
Tax reform.
If I said that, I'd be perplexed why I would say that, because the one thing the Republicans can always be counted on to support is a tax cut. It's what they live to do. So you've seen things like, well, again, I mentioned the EPA earlier, where you've got a very policy-focused group of people who are carrying out the day-to-day reform efforts there in a very effective way, I think. Is that because we've got great presidential leadership on that front? Well, I don't really see a ton of evidence for that, but at least he's staying out of the way, so you can say that much for him. There are bigger and broader things that I think probably could be done and should be done that just really aren't on the agenda, but I'm not sure they would be on the agenda for another Republican president either, just because they're very difficult things to do. For instance, our long-term most important fiscal problem is entitlement reform. Trump has, in all of his public statements on that, pronounced himself opposed to it. So there are some important things like that should be on the agenda that are simply beyond discussion at the moment. And I think that is, again, it's a long-term problem. A lot of these other issues are going to become fairly small-looking when you've got a situation in which entitlement spending alone is eating up 70 or 75%, or, well, gosh, might be already close to that, of federal revenue.
Yeah, it's getting up there.
Yeah.
Our last segment here is coming up here in just a minute, and I want to get back to talking a little bit about the Republican Party and the divide within the party. We'll be right back here with Kevin Williamson. And welcome back. Last segment here on Whiskey Politics, and delighted to have Kevin Williamson join us today. So I was meeting with some friends last night. We were having a chat, and it actually, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you was discussed last night, and I wanted to get your perspective on what does good character mean to you?
Well, gosh, as a Catholic, I have lately been reminded that the character of the people in leadership positions in all sorts of institutions is a key and critical issue. Look, I'm not a Pollyanna about stuff. There are a lot of people who've done a lot of good and useful things in our history who were not great, morally upstanding people. Certainly, men like Ulysses Grant had their personal failings. Eisenhower as well, for that matter. That being said, I think that particularly as our politics becomes unfortunately focused on the presidency and on the person of the president, which I think is in and of itself an unhealthy and worrisome development, but the character and quality of the man we put in that office, I think, is of great concern. The president talked about wanting to clean up Washington, drain the swamp, as he put it, and we've just seen his lawyer and the chairman of his campaign being convicted on, corruption, tax evasion, other sorts of charges. So, who you associate with, how you associate with them, how you conduct your life. These things are important. They are an indicator of how you're going to behave yourself in office. We saw that with Bill Clinton. We've seen it with other people. And so that aspect of Trump, is a continuing worry to me.
The reason that I asked the question is because one of the biggest issues that is being still to this day lobbed at each other on forums like Ricochet and others is about that character. And one of the questions that I have for somebody that I deeply respect, such as yourself, and read you quite frequently, is I take a look at the promises this president has made. And I don't know if you remember our conversation. I was not going to vote for this president either. I was a Rubio Fiorina guy. But I made the decision, it was a tactical decision, that I just rather not have her, and I crossed my fingers. I'm surprised, like many of my friends on the right of the center, at the number of promises this president has made and is pushing through and is keeping. And for me, step outside of the personal issues. I don't care about call girls and porn stars, okay? The palace intrigue, it doesn't intrigue me. But I take a look at it from a political standpoint and results. And has he not, I'm just trying to understand what promises has Trump broken thus far?
Well, I don't think I've said that he broke any promises, did I?
No, I don't think you personally have, or I'm not referring to anything that you personally said, but again, coming back to the divide that we have on the right, which I think is extremely damaging. I really do believe it's damaging to conservatism because Trump is a placeholder. Bush was a placeholder. And as a party, as an ideology, I think most of us would agree on the issues that are being tackled or even in many cases passed are all the issues that I think most of us would agree are good. You know, if we talk about regulatory reform.
If I can interrupt you for a second there.
Please.
I think your line of questioning is, in a sense, here illuminating, because you haven't asked me about policy differences within the party. You asked me what I think about the president. And the fact that the president and our feelings toward him, and whether we like him or don't like him or approve of him or disapprove of him, has become the central focus of what we talk about when we talk about politics on the right. And we are not a monarchy. We are not yet an autocracy with a strongman junta government. We're a republic with a legislature and an executive and a judicial branch. And this obsessive thing of, will you make a public statement of loyalty to the president, which is what you're asking for when you're asking about, well, what promises has he broken? Aren't you happy about this and aren't you happy about that? This is not about policy. This is about identity. This is about making a public statement of fealty to a political character, which is not something that I do.
I don't think that was suggested in any way. I think we can, there's a term calling balls and strikes, and there's, you can stand up and you could say, I disagree with this policy. I disagree with that policy. I disagree with trade for these reasons. All fine. Honest intellectual debate. And I'm not referring so much to something that you personally may be suggesting, but I think you do represent a wing of conservatism. You're not a Republican, that many people would point to in reference to, again, this is stuff that has been written, and it's about not seeing the long game, the end game here.
Yeah, I don't think I'm probably really representative of much of anything, and I've never really tried to be. Mm-hmm. There are people on the right who broadly share my view that Donald Trump is not a very good person and probably we should have elected someone else president. I think that most people don't understand their own political thinking, and that these questions about, well, don't you think it's probably part of the long game, is just another way of asking about what are your feelings toward the president as a person. And I think that this is a confused and backward way of trying to understand what's going on in American political life and American governance.
Where do you see the Republican Party in 8 years from now?
Well, I think the Republican Party has revealed itself as an organization whose leadership don't really care very much about the policies they've been talking about for the last 40 or 50 years. The parties as such are not really very important anymore. In the modern era of fundraising and media, all the parties really matter for is ballot access. They're important because they are written into electoral law in certain kinds of ways. So the question of where the Republican Party as such is going, well, I don't really know. I don't really know a lot of Republican Party leaders, and I don't spend a lot of time thinking about them. If you want to talk about where the conservative movement is going, I maybe have a little bit more to say about that. And there's an interesting problem there, too, which is how much of what we do is about advocating particular policies and ideas and principles, and how much of it is about we have to win elections and get X, Y, and Z done. And for a lot of people, Barack Obama's I won justification for everything he did is something they're willing to embrace for us on the right as well. That, the idea that figures like, say, Mitt Romney must have been somehow defective or inadequate because he didn't win the election. And so we are looking at a question of how much of what we do is supposed to be about ideas and how much of what we do is supposed to be about operational politics, about organizing campaigns, winning elections, swaying the mass electorate, and that kind of thing. And there's obviously room in the world for both of those things. Operational politics isn't really what I do, and swaying mass electorates isn't really an interest of mine. Not to say that there's not a legitimate and valuable role for people who do that. Which one of those tendencies is going to be the dominant concern among the conservative movement at large, I think, is an open question.
I think it also is going to depend upon how history is going to view the results from this president. And I know we're only 20 months in, so there's at least a couple of years left, maybe not. I don't know after yesterday's news, and maybe a different term. So I think, yeah, when we take a look at it, we have to look at it through the lens of history. And I appreciate your intellectual honesty in how you approach this. And, you know, like I said, I don't think we have to agree with each other 100% of the time, to follow each other, read each other, and so on, because you make people think, and I greatly do appreciate that.
I'm sure I agree with myself 100% of the time. So I think
so. Right. Last question for you, and I do appreciate you taking the time today, Kevin. And this goes back to what we're seeing right now as far as an affront on free speech, on the First Amendment in this country. Do you have genuine concerns that this is getting worse and we're heading into something that's much darker than we've seen before?
Yes and no. So the First Amendment as such is a legal and constitutional question. First Amendment jurisprudence for the last 10, 20 years has been really pretty good. I think that the courts, in particular the Supreme Court, are in the right place on that. On the Democratic side, on the left of center side, there is a great deal of antipathy toward legal protections for free speech, which of course is what Citizens United was about and a number of other things. These people on the left who are arguing that people should be prosecuted for their views on global warming because it's not really a political debate that amounts to fraud or endangerment or something, who want people legally sanctioned for engaging in political advocacy, that want to legally block companies, associations, groups of people from engaging in advocacy, who want to put political debate under government discipline. I think that is a worrisome tendency, and one that we fortunately right now have, I think, a pretty good body of federal jurisprudence standing in the way. The more worrisome issue is, do we have a culture of free and open democratic discourse and a culture of free speech? And I think that is something that is very much under assault. And I think that goes back to this overwhelming sense of tribalism that we have right now, that people who disagree with me not only are wrong, but should be silenced, that it should be wrong for someone to be able to say this sort of thing. I remember I wrote a column once that was kind of controversial because it was published in the Chicago Sun-Times about some transgender issues. And the critics of that column, many of them anyway, didn't just simply argue that I was wrong about what I was saying, but it should be illegal to say these things because it amounts to some kind of, endangerment. It's basically a species of assault. And that line of thinking, I think, is really quite dangerous. I think the people who control a lot of the important media companies, meaning Facebook, Google, Twitter, which are much more important than companies like, say, the New York Times are, I think, anymore, don't have very healthy and robust commitments to open discourse as much as they advertise themselves as being people who do. So I think those things are worrisome, but in general, I'm actually pretty confident that we're in a good place.
You think we're in a good place? You think these kids are going to grow out of it like they've done in previous generations, or
I think they're insignificant for the most part. We're having a kind of moment right now of mass hysteria about, oh my God, the New York Times hired someone I don't like, or the Atlantic hired someone I don't like. But these are little social trends that come and go, and they don't last very long, I don't think.
Yeah, well, unlike the Atlantic, the New York Times kept the person.
Yeah, that's true. That was a good institutional decision on their part. And kudos to them for standing up for themselves.
Gotcha. There's so many more questions I have on all of these issues. This is one of those things that I do appreciate you taking the time and giving us your perspective on things, and hopefully we can have you on again in not too long. So, Kevin, where can folks find you now? National Review?
NationalReview.com is the easiest place.
Great. And are you still on social media? Active?
I don't have any social media that I know of, I don't think.
Okay. All right. Kevin D. Williamson, National Review. And again, greatly appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Take care.
All right. Take care. And folks, you can find us at whiskeypolitics.net. And don't forget to click that subscribe button on YouTube. Find us at Ricochet, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and America's Voice Television Network. Until next time, folks, Dave Sussman, Whiskey Politics.